So I know the Koyan Dark needing a buff thing is an overplayed joke on the channel at this point, and I certainly received, quite a bit of comments saying, "What do you think she actually needed for a buff?" Or, "Stop it, it's getting annoying because she clearly doesn't need a buff." So I feel like maybe I should make a very casual video explaining why I really wanted her to have a buff. And also, I will say these comments are justified. Like, if you're using Koyan Dark like a normal person would, she is probably mid to slightly above average tier, I'd say, amongst all SSRs in the game. Obviously, depending on the use case, she can even be quite a powerful and generally useful unit. Most of the times, you are using her as like a multi-core farmer because she has a very convenient party-wide 30 MP battery that also has a party-wide buster up tied to it. She of course also has extra synergy with animal trait, servants, and the overcharge also gives her great synergy with other multi-core DPSs such as Tonelico being the most notable one. But in general, overcharge boosting can just help like anti-trait damage in a lot of the cases. So yeah, she's not horrible. She obviously has her own issues. Her MP damage is a little bit low, so you might want a slightly higher MP level Koyan Dark. Otherwise, sometimes she can't even clear the first wave of like higher end 90++ nodes. But she also has a couple of great like anti-challenge quest stuff, like offensive buff removal and invul pierce on her third skill, right? So she's not horrible. She doesn't really need a buff, but whether you need a buff or not has never been the standard of whether Lasengo actually gives the character a buff or not. Like, we've definitely seen characters like Nero, Skahak, and even Merlin getting buffs this year, who are, in my opinion, all servants that don't really need a buff at all. They're already at the upper echelon of SSRs. Merlin is a bit of a separate case because buffing meta supports generally has a bigger impact to the game, so I do like those. But if you look at characters like Skahak and Nero, they really don't need buffs, like at all. They were already really high tier. The buff just pushed them over the edge. The reason why I really want a buff for Koyan Dark is because of my personal, main way of enjoying the game. So once again, I'm not saying this is justified, I'm just saying that's why I really wanted her to get a buff, which is of course min turning. And recently I've been chasing more high-end min turning. So for example, you do like self-restrictions, maybe you cut 2 members from your team, you're doing only a 4-man clear, or you're even doing just a frontline only clear, or maybe you're not bringing an offensive CE on your DPS. Like, those are kind of like speedrun categories if you think about it, right? So those are the types of stuff that I really dedicate my time and my account to doing nowadays. So Koyan Dark obviously isn't the most self-sufficient of offensive DPS sometimes, because a lot of her offensive buffs are, lower number because they're party-wide. That's fair. Traditionally, Koyan can sort of mitigate that by having extreme synergy with Douman and Van Gogh. Douman, obviously, the strongest chaotic evil buffer in the game, 100% crits, 40% attack up, 30% defense down, and his Bonzi is another 30% MP damage up for chaotic evil. So Koyan Dark is very much benefiting a lot from him. And also Van Gogh, giving a whopping 100% extra crit up per MP when using Van Gogh with Koyan is obviously really strong. Koyan can very easily hit critical damage cap, which is 500%, with Van Gogh. So that's all good. But recently, because of a couple of changes in the game, I think Koyan has really fallen off in that regard in terms of min turning. So here's a couple of reasons why. So first of all, Van Gogh and Douman are already kind of anti-min turn supports. Well, what do you mean by that? You literally just said they give so much crit buffs to Koyan Dark. What do you mean by anti-min turn? Well, one of the biggest parts about min turning is to cycle out your supports, or having one of your supports taunted most of the time, and then have the boss kill them so you can have another support from your backline come up, right? The first reason why this is important is, of course, your main DPS will become stronger as the turn goes on because you have more and more buffers coming up to buff them. And the second most important part with that is, of course, you reshuffle your deck. Because if you just take a look at any of my min turns with Koyan Dark on my channel, a lot of the RNGs that she require is like maybe getting 2 buster cards on turn 1, another buster card on turn 2, and 2 more buster cards on turn 3, which is traditionally impossible because she only has 2 buster cards in her deck. So she's only getting 2 buster attacks across 3 turns, right? But obviously, whenever you reshuffle the deck, it's just RNG. You redraw all of your cards. So that is actually what 90% of the time that people spend on min turns are, which is just resetting for card RNG, which obviously really sucks. But that's just how it is. So Van Gogh and Douman actively sabotages that because they can both cast Terror on the enemy, so the enemy has a chance to get stunned randomly, and when they get stunned, they can't kill your quote-unquote esports support, right? And Douman has the added thing of casting Attack Down on the enemy, so the enemy can't even easily, crit or just face card down one of your supports. Van Gogh, on the other hand, has a party-wide evade that can potentially protect one of your esports supports. Obviously, you can play around it. It's kind of like Merlin, where you just, pop the party-wide evade or invul on turn 1, and then you swap one of your supports out for the actual esports support, so they don't have the defensive effect on them. But still, sometimes it makes it a little bit less flexible because for some reason you might want to save the defense down on Van Gogh's second skill for one of the specific break bars, for example. So Van Gogh's also kind of anti-min turning. And another problem with Van Gogh is that a lot of the times when you're trying to push damage, especially with an AoE character like Koyan Dark, especially when you're pushing her to do something like a Super Recollection quest, which has like over 1 million HP per break bar, you really want to use a Brave Chain. A Brave Chain means that you're selecting more attacking cards from your main DPS, but also it means that you get extra attack. And extra attacks over the years has become a very powerful source of damage because of Append 1, because of class score, even though Koyan Dark doesn't have her class score yet. So this problem would actually get worse later on. But you're omitting a lot by fitting in a support character's MP instead of picking a Brave Chain. So sometimes you can't really afford to fit in Van Gogh despite how much buffs she's giving her. And the second reason behind why I said Koyan Dark sort of fell off in terms of min turning is, of course, because of this anniversary. We got Append 4, Append 5, and post-buff Merlin. So the basic gist of why this matters is that crit buffing steroids are worth less and less as the year goes on, because we have so many extra ways of getting passive crit buffs from the game that it's kind of insane, right? So obviously Append 4 is just 30% extra crits passively, and we also have class score, which, to be fair, Koyan Dark and foreigners don't have it in general yet, but when they do, they're going to have a bunch of crit buffs passively from that as well. So as we all know in FGO, the more you add on to the same type of buff, the more diminishing each subsequent buff in terms of effect is going to be, right? So in terms of boosting total damage, let's say, adding a 50% crit up to a character that already has 400% crit up is not going to increase the total damage by a lot compared to if you were to add 50% crit up to a character that doesn't have any crit buffs on them yet. So having so many crit buffs, you risk hitting critical cap, and in general, critical buffs are just not worth that much anymore. So post-buff Merlin's existence is kind of like an extension of that issue. Once again, Koyan Dark heavily benefits from Van Gogh and Douman synergy, who are both very crit-heavy buffers, right? And now with post-buff Merlin, he's kind of like a universal version of Van Gogh and Douman. Obviously, they're not like that similar to each other, but in terms of pushing crit damage, post-buff Merlin does it very well for all Buster Servants. So essentially, the gap between Koyan Dark and other Buster Servants are narrowed by a lot with post-buff Merlin, because a lot of times you're running Merlin with Koyan Dark over someone like Van Gogh anyways, because of the various problems Van Gogh has in min turns that I mentioned earlier. And when you're using like basically the same comp with characters such as Koyan Dark and compare that to someone like Khan, then obviously Koyan Dark's lack of self-steroids is going to show a lot compared to more selfish offensive DPSs. And finally, Append 5 heavily benefits characters that have short cooldowns as well as strong skills. So with short cooldowns, you can very easily double cast a DPS's skills. And you know, with certain quests that don't allow duplicates back in the day, single Koyan Light really sucks because the cooldown reduction by 2 without pairing with another cooldown reduction by 2 usually is wasted in like a min turn, because those usually last like 3 to 4 turns at max. But now with a Pen 5, characters with short cooldowns at like 5 turns or even shorter benefits a lot from, you know, Koyan Light. You can even use other cooldown reducers like Summary Buki to push that even further, right? And the second thing, of course, is how much value do you get from double casting your skills? So characters with very strong self-steroids are going to benefit a lot from a Pen 5 as well. And Koyan Dark kind of doesn't have either. Like, her skill cooldowns are 6, 7, 6. So yes, a Pen 5 does allow her to double cast her second skill in Buster Looping, but her MP damage already sucks, so her Buster Looping still isn't great at all by any means. And Koyan Dark's skills in general are just not worth that much if we only look at how much buffs she is getting from it herself, because once again, you know, all of her buffs are party-wide, so the numbers individually are going to be lower compared to more selfish DPSs. So she doesn't benefit that much from a Pen 5 compared to most other Buster DPSs that are more dedicated at boss killing. So overall, I'm not saying Koyan Dark really needs a buff. Like, she's not a horrible character in desperate need of saving, but she is pretty close of being like a top tier. And back in the day, because of her very unique synergies with 2 very powerful crit buffers in the game, she can actually be one of the strongest like Buster AoEs in terms of min turning. But nowadays, the advantages she used to have no longer are that relevant, and other Buster AoEs are just catching up, you know, very, very quickly. So what buff would I give to Koyan Dark if possible? Well, first of all, give her an MP upgrade, right? Because an MP upgrade would benefit literally everyone who's using her, because people who use her normally, which are people who usually use her in multi-core farming, one of her biggest issues with that is, of course, her own poor MP damage, so she might not even clear like a wave 1 enemies on 90++ sometimes, which is pathetic. So giving her a base MP damage increase, of course, would mitigate that problem by a lot, especially for lower MP copies of Koyan Dark. Secondly, you could also give her like a cooldown reduction on one of her skills, maybe just for animal trait servants, and then, you know, make it cooldown reduction by 1, for example, or, you know, give it like cooldown reduction by 1 and another self-buff effect steroid, maybe like an attack up or like buster up, for example, because, you know, cooldown reduction is a Tamamo phase thing. Like, we got Koyan Light, we got Tamamo, so why not give Koyan Dark a weaker version of a cooldown reduction? Because I obviously don't want Koyan Dark to have another like cooldown reduction by 2 and make things crazy like Koyan Light, right? But maybe give her some kind of selfish cooldown reduction that only applies to animal traits, or even just apply to Koyan faces. That would be pretty funny, or Tamamo faces, I mean. So those are some of my brief like ideas for buffs. I'm not going to list out my like custom servant buff here, but yeah, I definitely think Koyan Dark is a character where if you give her a buff that actually solves some of her issues, she would become one of the best AoE buster characters in the game. But unfortunately, this probably would never happen. I'll probably also not complain about it that much anymore, because I think this is like the nail in the coffin. The fact that she got another banner and still didn't get a buff, and we also got 2 foreigner buffs this Annie, and neither of them are on Koyan Dark. I think this is literally Lesengel saying, we're not going to buff this character ever. So I'm just going to put my Copium in Summer Koyan, and then hope she is really broken in mid turns or something. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this ramble, and see you guys in the next one.